So, welcome back. Welcome to the third session in this series. My intention with this series was to provide you with a somewhat diverse exploration of different entry points into sequencing. I am very much a yoga and movement mutt, and while my movement practice kind of started with, technically I would say it started with dance. I have a background as a performer. I grew up doing theater, regional theater, and studied acting and theater in school. So, my first introduction to kind of movement learning, kinesthetic learning, was through dance classes. Although I'm not like a professional dancer, that was a part of our education. And I always really appreciated and enjoyed the kind of movement puzzle of watching someone do something and then endeavoring to map that same movement or similar movement in my own body, and then kind of the feedback loop of like, how did I do? What we're going to look at a little bit today is sort of approaching our movement practice from a more, what we might call a somatic approach, which again, for me, really started in acting school, where a lot of the warm-ups that we would have in our movement class, or the ways that we were trained to tap into our instrument, our physical emotive instrument of expression, was through movement and through exploring kind of the life of the various characters that we were being asked to portray or to play, by kind of stepping into their movement habits and stepping into the way that their psychology expressed through their physicality. So that was something that I was always interested in, although I didn't really have language around it. And it's interesting, I think when I first found yoga, what I loved about yoga, as someone that never really had a very loving relationship or empowering relationship around fitness, I liked that yoga addressed more aspects of my personhood than just kind of the physical, or at least kind of the physical training. There was an inquiry component to the practice, to not just do the thing, but also to reflect on how that thing impacted me and how it touched me and what I learned about myself through the process of engaging with my tissues and my movements and my physicality. And to that extent, all of the practices that I engage in now are somewhat somatic, soma being like of the body, experience that we have in our body. But there's different ways that we can kind of further kind of dive into that realm of movement exploration, and ways that we might kind of put it off to the side in pursuit of a particular skill. Okay, so again, the intention with these 4 sessions is to look at a distinctly unique entry point into mapping and exploring movement, which means that we're not going to get too deep in any rabbit hole before it's time to kind of pop out and jump into another one. But the common denominator, the common thread of all of these is you, right? It's like we can label our movements or identify our movement as different approaches or different techniques, even within the yoga world, yoga system. We have vinyasa, we have alignment, there's Ashtanga, Iyengar, Bikram. These are the names of people that have developed their own systems and approach to movement. And likewise, when we go into other forms of movement, say somatic training, we have also the last names of individuals that are innovators and developers of these systems: Feldenkrais, Laban, Bartenieff, Bainbridge Cohen, etc. So as always, the goal, at least my goal with everything that I teach, is that I can pass it on to the individual that's learning it, that you can embody it for yourself, and that you can likewise make it your own. So, sometimes when I teach things, people want me to label what it is and who it comes from. And while I'm more than happy to pay tribute to my teachers and the people that have influenced me, ultimately, I adopt the perspective that you are the owner, you are the authority of your own movements. And if the movement teaching is effective and you embody the teaching, then it's yours, right? Nobody owns your ability to move other than you. The best we can hope to do is inspire you with different approaches and perhaps encourage new options and pathways and habit, muscular and neuromuscular habit, that you can adopt to fulfill your goals and also to express yourself. I had the realization, or kind of the thought occurred to me, because my approach to yoga over the years has been very goal oriented, whether that was wanting to, get out of pain if there was a particular area that was giving me pain, to develop strength, to nail a particular pose or be able to get into a pose successfully. Kind of occurred to me, like, what would happen? What if, like, played the game? What if I was able to do every pose? What if I had no pain in my body? What if my mobility and my flexibility was at its sort of ideal level? What if I wasn't ever working on anything, any particular skill? What then? Would I still move? Would I still practice? Would I still explore? And the answer was yes. Right? It's like if I'm learning an instrument, there's kind of the stages of skill development where I'm going to be practicing my scales. I'm going to be working with a teacher. I'm going to be, listening for areas of improvement. And of course, that can always continue. But at some point, the instrument and your ability to play that instrument is tuned enough and developed enough that then you can begin expressing yourself through the instrument. Right? That's kind of, to a certain extent, where the real fun begins. Where, yes, there's a satisfaction in getting better at a skill, but really our capacity to express and to share and to use our body and our mind and our heart as a vehicle to communicate with the world. That's really kind of the peak pose that I'm working towards. And so when I sort of got out of the realm of always kind of working towards particular goals in my practice, and realize and recognize, truthfully, it was accompanied during a time that I was going through quite a lot of grief and kind of emotional pain. I realized that these practices are also really beautiful in helping me to express what's going on inside. Right. So I just want to kind of offer that as some food for thought as we move forward. We've looked quite a bit already at different strategies to regress, to progress, to develop strength, to kind of improve and enhance the abilities and skills of ourselves or of our students. But there's sort of an aspect of our movement practice that we might call training, and then there's an aspect of our movement practice that we might call expressing. And I want to be clear that in the expression of ourselves through our practice or through our movements, sometimes that's not the most direct way to access our training, right? Like the vinyasa practice in many ways sort of asks us to express and dance and move through these postures. That might not be the best way to teach the postures, right? Especially if there's a deficiency or a lack of capacity to sustain and to organize ourselves in those poses. So in today's session, or in this session, we're going to speak a little bit less to the aspect of movement or mobility training, and we're going to talk a little bit more about expressing, I suppose, and how we can use our movement practice to explore different themes and different things that we might be experiencing in our life, on the mat and off the mat in sort of a micro and a macrocosmic level. And add in what I find to be really unique about the yoga practice versus other forms of training, which is this aspect of self-inquiry, and really pulling on the threads of metaphor to suggest that what happens in our body happens in our somatic experience is and can be reflective of what's happening in our lives in a larger sense. So it's this conversation that I'll call theming that we're going to talk about today. And we've sort of hinted at that a little bit through the previous sessions, but we're going to dive more specifically into that aspect of sequencing and a little bit less in kind of the mechanical skill building aspects of teaching movement. So show of hands, there's 122 of you in here right now. Show of hands, who was here this morning? Who's back? Back for more? Okay, I see about 100 of you back for more. That's good. I never take for granted the fact that you have come back, Right? It's one thing to come and check it out, another thing to choose to come back. So thanks for coming back. And who's here live for the first time today? Who's tuning in finally live for the first time? Okay, about 10 of you. At least 10 of you raised your hand. Very good. Welcome. I'm Rocky. Thanks for hanging out. So as is customary for me, I always like to kind of take a step or two back before we forge ahead and move forward. And I'm aware too that the nature of so much of what we do requires a process of assimilation to really digest and kind of make sense of what's been experienced, what's been heard, what's been integrated. So I guess I'm not so much interested in taking questions right now in that we did that like an hour or so ago. We have a Q&A session at the end of this, but I would love to hear from you guys. If you can just type a few things in the chat box so far based on the last two sessions, perhaps what some of your biggest takeaways have been so far. That could just be like an aha moment, a light bulb moment for you that you've had, however large or small. My intention with these trainings is, as I said yesterday, single thing. You know, this is a mixed level training. You're entering it with different levels of familiarity, interest, intention, but that you get something that can enhance, evolve, and contribute to your approach. Right? So, if anything comes to mind, feel free to pop it in the chat box, and I'd love to hear what you guys are receiving based on what I'm offering. So I see honoring the reality that every body is different and shows up different, and that doesn't necessarily equate to danger or wrong. Beautiful. There are so many ways to build dynamic and transformative yoga classes. I love the variety, and these tools will really help me expand my classes. Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. This is from Samantha. Power versus control versus stability for the different types of contractions. Cool. Yeah, you know, my brain tends to kind of, I said yesterday, I'm a Virgo. I love organization. And, you know, organization can sometimes end to kind of reductive modes of thinking, but having these different kind of boxes and labels and places where we can put everything at least helps to kind of make sense of the complexity of it all. Carrie says, I love the regress progress worksheet as I work mostly with privates for tourists. I often only do 1 or 2 classes, so this will allow me to better prepare when I don't know their abilities beforehand. Awesome. Let's see, yeah, lots of good takeaways from the regress to progress. Ooh, there's a lot in here. A lot of cool tools, good. Love learning how much you can do supine or prone on the mat, opening and strengthening. Yeah. Kristen says, I'm absolutely loving the closed to open chain movements with the body and then holding in an isometric way to build strength. Yeah, a lot of the movements we do in yoga in the name of kind of increasing our range of motion are closed chain movements where we can leverage force to hold our joints in sort of their passive end range. And I'm not someone that like rails against that. I think that can feel really good. There's a lot that could be said about the benefits of that. But opening chains can be a pretty interesting way to not just develop your strength, but get kind of a more honest snapshot of the ranges of motion that you're able to sustain. Let's see. Whole new respect for the power of imagination and how you can truly embody it. Cool. Alexandra, I truly like when you ask that we follow our movement with our eyes. You seem to have limited the direction of our gaze. We'll talk about that a little bit more today. Polly, I love the explanation of the various methods for toning and strengthening muscles. Compensation in a pose is an opportunity to explore. Love the idea of contextual interference. Ashtangis might benefit from that. Yeah, Ashtangis might also rebel against that. But yeah, it's you know, the notion of sadhana, or whatever it is that we do in pursuit of a goal, and also this concept of abhyasa, of consistent daily repetition of a thing, is quite prevalent in the yoga system. And I'm not against that. You know, I have kind of my morning sadhana, which often looks like a repetitive process that I can do no matter where I'm in the world. It looks like, you know, writing and meditating, pranayama, some mobility work. And I you know, because my life is so dynamic, a little less so now, but because it was, having something that is a consistent recursive aspect of my day is of benefit. So it's not to say that there's anything wrong with repetition, but at the exclusion of other things, we can certainly vary our approach to movement. I like the isometric part to bring awareness. Love the regress progress. Love new ways of thinking about creating accessibility. Here. Expanding, from Sarah, expanding the value of each and every pose and pose breakdown, and to appreciate the regression opportunities. They are limitless, indeed. And what's nice about that too, I have a library full of books that are like pose modifications. I used to fervently go through the books and try to memorize all the modifications of the pose. So when I was able to kind of understand, how pose modifications are various regressions or progressions of the pose, it sort of unlocked my own ability to develop those modifications and further understand why the modifications are labeled as such, which only further empowered my ability to choose and create on my own. Light bulb moment. I haven't always stuck with a vinyasa structure for the classes. I've begun teaching outside of the structured studio and have had more freedom in the past year to make my classes whatever I want. This training has given me more ideas to make my students' bodies to feel more accessible in them in yoga. Does that make sense? I hope so. Yeah, that's kind of the goal, right? There can be a sort of security that we can adopt when the options are limited. It's this and not this. This is the way to do it. The way that I learned yoga and the way that I was kind of taught to teach yoga was to very much limit the options and go for specific targeted goals. That might have looked like sequencing in a particular way, aligning a pose in a particular way. Even the word vinyasa etymologically means to arrange or to organize something in a particular way. And I don't have a problem with that. I think it's very useful in the development of a skill to create the discernment needed to do something in a particular way. But when the messaging is that every other way is wrong or every other way is inappropriate or you should never do it the other way, then that discernment becomes limiting as opposed to expansive, right? So we can create options for folks by having them do specific things at specific times without giving them the message that this is the right way. So right way is relative to your goals and to your intentions. Well, it's a good problem to have. You guys have a lot of takeaways here. Tracy says, I love the idea of taking a photo of a pose and turning it around to explore the shape, and limitless regression tools help tremendously to send a class home to the heart of the yogi. I love that. Very cool. Okay, sweet. Well, it's, with everything that I offer, my intention, and I often recommend this, for teachers that find themselves experiencing insecurity or nervousness or fear, kind of on the front end of teaching, just sidebar, I'm going to say this just so that you're not alone. Teaching in this way for me is a brand new thing, and I was tremendously nervous starting this series. Nervousness is something that I'm always working with. And I try to transmute into excitement, but I don't think any of us are immune from that feeling of like, what if it doesn't work? What if I'm exposed as a fraud? Like all these different ideas that our inner critic says to us. And one of the ways that I have learned to mitigate my nerves is to remember that it's not about me. I'm not here to show you how much I know. Or how much I don't know. I'm here to assist you in learning something new. So the more I can be clear on what my goals are for you in your learning, the less time I have to kind of ruminate in my own insecurity about myself. So that inner critic doesn't really ever go away, but I can learn to kind of have him sit over to the side. Sometimes I give him time to express through my movement practices, and other times I ask him to sit patiently and wait till it's his turn to speak. So all that's to say, the fact that you guys are learning things and the fact that you are receiving valuable information from this means that I'm doing my job. So thank you for giving me a chance to do that. Remembering service. Okay, so let's let's talk a little bit about the class that you all experienced. Some of you I know tuned into the class live back on Easter Sunday when I taught it. Some of you have done the recording since, and some of you just likely did it in the last couple hours. I would love to hear some of your feedback from that class. Again, by feedback, I mean what were some of your takeaways from that class? What did you like? What did you, and not just like, I liked that it was backbends, but like, what about the class was effective for you, if it was effective? What were some points of learning? What were some highlights in your experience? As it relates to questions, I'm happy to answer questions about the class and the sequence, but we'll save that for the end. So, if things were confusing for you or if things brought up questions, feel free to share those. I will just likely address them towards the end of the session. Final sequence to Natarajasana was the plot twist. Backbends are difficult for me, and the rotation in prone worked well and was accessible. Good. Love the flow, linking of similar movements. The class was excellent understanding progression after yesterday's session. Good. There, sequencing is a factor not just in the sequencing of a class, but also the sequencing of a training over the arc of a weekend. So I tried to sequence these sessions in such a way that the information would come into clearer view. The somatic, specifically prone, helped me feel a lot less comfort in the movement. Everything felt more open and effortless. Okay. I loved the class and how it progressed from a single elbow lift to full Natarajasana, also the single leg up dog. Felt so good on the quads. More comfort. Got you. Lizelle? Love the theme and also love the variety of regression to progressions. Brought it all together from yesterday's session. Cool. Finally, I liked the building on the poses. Oops. And following the sequencing you used to build the pose. It was helpful to see in practice. Very good. Okay, well, thank you for practicing with me, and thank you for the feedback. I'll share that this class was born from several different starting points. There's sort of the movement entry point that I chose. There was the postural category that I wanted to explore. There was the fact that this class, I knew was going to be a Facebook Live class. I actually don't know how many people tuned in, but I saw something like 30 or 40,000 views on the video. So it was quite possibly the largest class I ever taught to the broadest demographic. So I really wanted it to be an all levels type of experience. And it also happened to fall on Easter. And in the midst of a global pandemic and all of us being at home. So there were a lot of different forces at play that sort of coalesced to form this particular class. But most notable for me was the theme of it being Easter. And, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I understand kind of the symbology of Easter and what it represents, in terms of new beginnings and possible resurrection, kind of rising from the ashes, and this reminder in the wake of spring equinox, that after death comes new life, and that new life also doesn't always mean kind of flowers and daisies and roses, but new life can also be precluded by a sort of fervor and the need to kind of push through and develop a sort of restlessness that ultimately births into beauty. And that's very much been my personal experience throughout my life, but certainly throughout the last several weeks and months. And I wanted to teach a class and facilitate an experience that likely, resonated and connected with our shared predicament and our shared circumstances, both kind of on the micro and on the macro. So speaking of theme, theming is something, truthfully, that I held a lot of insecurity around when I first started teaching and well into teaching, because I would experience teachers do it really, really well. And I would experience teachers do it really not so well. And to me, a theme done like not well is a theme that sort of feels obligatory, something that's kind of like beat over your head while you're trying to have a movement practice. You kind of get like a teacher reading nice sounding quotes to you while you're like struggling in a lunge. Um, yeah, and it became, you know, I think there was also a part of me that felt like if a class is good, it has a theme. It has to have a theme in order for it to be good. And so, you know, as I was kind of a newer teacher, I really struggled to try to check all the boxes of what I thought made for a great class. You know, I wanted a really great playlist. I wanted a really like intelligent sequence. I wanted, you know, to check the box of every category of pose a person could want to do. I wanted the alignment to be really, intelligent. I wanted it to be inspiring. I wanted it to be educational. I wanted to appear smart. Like there were so many things I was trying to accomplish that inevitably one or more of those things kind of fell to the wayside. And the class kind of lost some of its potency. So it was very liberating for me when I realized some years ago that, like, you know, you don't have to do every single thing really well every single time. You can do one thing really well and create a much more meaningful experience for yourself and for your students. And then tomorrow's class, you can do something else really well. The invitation to practice yoga is not, you know, you learn about, say, the limbs of yoga, the instruction is not to do all of them at once, right? You kind of move progressively through each one. Even the sutras themselves, you know, they're all kind of contained in the seed of that first sutra. You know, we're going to practice yoga, and this is what yoga is. But they unfold incrementally, and in the same way, we unfold incrementally. And in the same way, a class can unfold incrementally. And it's okay to take a lot of things off the table so that you can focus on doing one thing really well. A couple useful quotes that I've heard over the years. One is from, I believe, Darren Rhodes, said that your theme should be leverage and not luggage. Just suggests that if you are going to speak to a theme, that theme should assist the success of your students in that class. It shouldn't just be something that kind of bogs them down with more things to think about. Something else that I've heard said from my friend and colleague and mentor Noah Mazet, who kind of suggested that, you know, every time that you practice yoga, every time that you engage in a practice and you engage in that practice skillfully, you are embodying yoga philosophy. That might depend on which, you know, philosophical current you're a part of, but, you know, so much of the philosophy of yoga is actionable. And it's actionable through the asana practice, right? So you don't need to be talking about all of these concepts all the time. You can put them into action, and that can be the way in which you embody the theme. So the first real lesson that I have on theming is that sometimes what is not said is more potent than what is said. And what's not said has an opportunity to be experienced and felt and embodied. And these are, after all, at least in my view, embodiment practices. Yeah, a brief story. I remember taking a class once at a hot yoga studio here in LA, and the teacher in the class had this theme of presence. Really, really wanted us to be present. And so in every single pose, you know, get us into the pose, and we're shaking and pouring sweat and feel like we're dying. And he's saying, like, be present, be present, be present. And I remember at one point we were in like a forward bend, and he said, like, just let go of all of your thoughts and stop thinking about stuff and be present. And I found myself thinking, boy, I'm really annoyed because I was being told to do something that felt impossible. And I was being told to do something that was sort of overwhelming the other things I was being told to do, like, you know, all the alignment and the don't die instruction of hot yoga. And I remember, as always, I've never forgotten this moment. In the class, there was a moment about halfway through the class, we were standing in Tadasana, and he said, bring your attention to your feet and notice the connection of your feet and the earth. Feel the distribution of your weight through your feet into the earth, and see if you can balance the distribution of weight through the corners of your feet. And I remember thinking in that moment of class, I was more present than in any other moment in class. And in that moment in class, I was thinking about my feet and the earth. So all the other things I was thinking about, how potentially annoyed I was, how uncomfortable I was, what I was going to do after class or what was going on in my life, all those things went away, and I was laser focused on that one instruction. And it was a powerful moment for me to realize that, the most potent way to help somebody experience presence is through helping them facilitate present moment awareness, become present about what's happening right now, as opposed to knocking me over the head with a lesson on why it's important to be present. So, for those of you that may not necessarily like front load or teach with a clear or articulatable theme in your class, I would suggest that every class that you teach has a theme. There's sort of the recursive, ever-present themes in yoga about skillfulness in action, right? About kind of focus and discernment, presence, discipline, whatever it is for you, this concept of adhikara, or kind of moving progressively into the various stages of what you're ready for. Right. So whether you identify it, whether you give it a Sanskrit name, whether you inspire people with the quote, your classes all have a theme, and they also likely all have every theme. So the concept of theming for me is often about finding a thread, pulling on that thread, and then figuring out how to make that thread an actionable experience in the lives of my students. Okay, so for this particular class, there was a noticeable or a notable theme that was discussed and that was embodied, and hopefully it was done so in a way that was leverage and not luggage. So what I'd like to do, before I dive into the sequencing, so to speak, of this class, is to take a look at the sequencing worksheet that I created for this class, which really is less about the sequence of poses and really more reflections on theme. So these are the various questions that I ask myself when I'm selecting or reflecting on a theme. And sometimes the starting point is a theme, is a quote, is a word, is a story, is an experience I'm having. And sometimes it's the opposite. I might go through a class like we've looked at already, regression, progression, isometric, whatever it is, and then kind of in the planning of that class, a theme sort of emerges, and maybe that's a theme that I keep to myself and I use to inform my posturing as a teacher. At other times, that theme might be something I actually speak to and share with my students. And sometimes it depends, right? So because I'm often presenting information to yogis, and I know that generalization, but a lot of yogis sort of want metaphor and they want theme, they want something more robust to contemplate besides, just strength training or mobility training. I'll often use a theme to sort of get the buy-in of yoga students to do this work that I want to do that might kind of bump up against their expectation of what a typical yoga class is. So sometimes the theme can be used to get buy-in. It's like, see, we're still doing yoga, even though we're doing an isometric drill for our outer rotators. The misconception, I think, that's quite prevalent is that the yoga practice is defined by particular shapes and particular movements, as opposed to the overall ethos of how we engage in our practice and in our process of development. So I'm going to pull up the sequencing worksheet. Show of hands, just curious, how many of you guys typically teach with a theme or have some experience around theming, or that's a common feature of the way that you teach? Okay, so I see about 50 of you raising your hand. So I'll take that to mean that the rest of you either don't typically work with a theme, or maybe you don't like theming. So all that is valid. All that is fine. Okay. So let's Let's see here. Pardon me while I get my bearings. Okay. So this is the worksheet that I created for this particular session. And it's again, it's a worksheet on theming. As is the case with all the worksheets, it's going to be mostly questions. And these questions are meant to stoke your own inquiry and to stimulate your own, kind of process of consideration and contemplation. I'm going to go through this worksheet and discuss the various principles in this worksheet relative to the class that we just took. So I will kind of tell you what my process was like, and then of course you can apply this to your own process. Okay. So the first question is really to identify what the theme is. And what I say here is, your starting point for class, it could be a quote, okay? It could be a story, it could be a philosophical concept. Janet, it could be an animal spirit card. It could be, whatever it is that you are inspired by or working with that day is fodder for a theme. It could be an energetic quality. So just as an example, this class that I taught was leveraged from a quote, not so much a story. If I was more well-versed in perhaps like the resurrection story, that could have been the starting point for this class. Philosophical concept could be like a Sanskrit word, or whether that's pulling on yoga philosophy or some other philosophy. Energetic quality, this class had the energetic quality of sort of uprising. That was not necessarily where I started, but that sort of were some dots that got connected for me from the starting point of the quote, Sanskrit word, etc. Whatever the theme, reflect on it below. And if the theme is more conceptual or based on a story, attempt to condense the theme into a word or a short phrase that contains its central idea. So, that's to say, if you're inspired by something, or if you're thinking about something, or if you've read a story, take some time to kind of write about it. What is the story? What are you experiencing and encountering and experiencing and ruminating on, and give yourself time to just kind of ramble and bob around and float around within the various aspects of that. But at a certain point, it's good to be able to condense that, right? It's like this concept of the Bij mantras. Like we have these elaborate sound vibrations that we can emit that say a lot, but we can also condense them into a central idea or a central sound, or even the universal sound of Om, in a sense, is kind of the seed of life. So how might you take a broader theme, a broader thematic concept, and condense it into something succinct? Now, oftentimes for me, the succinct condensing of the theme ends up becoming the title of the class. Okay, so in this particular class, the theme was condensed into the word, or into the instruction, rise up, okay, or uprising. This class, oftentimes when I'm thinking of titles for class, I want to make the titles almost like actionable, or like to have a verb, to be an instruction. I just find that tends to connect with people more than if the class was called like uprising. And it's sort of like, that's a nice idea, but like rise up, exclamation point, come to class, let's do this. Right? So the central theme idea for me becomes something that sort of strikes the person reading it or considering taking the class, and serves as almost the underlying instruction for all that follows. So if you took the class, I actually began this particular class by reading the quote that inspired me. And this quote I actually saw on someone's Instagram story. The day that I did this class, I was also featured, one of my classes was featured on another platform. And it was part of like a 30-day challenge. And so students were taking my class that day and posting kind of their videos of them having taken my class, which was nice. And so I was going through various students' stories and watching their like sped up version of them doing my class. And then of course, like it clicked over to the next video. And on one student in particular, I don't even have her name here, but she had posted an image. I think I have it here. I can like show you the image. She posted this really lovely graphic on her story with this quote that said, "In order for the flower to reach the sun, it must pass through the deep darkness of the dirt." And it really struck me for many reasons, but I liked the underlying message there. So if I was to go through this worksheet, I would start with that quote. In order for the flower to reach the sun, it must pass through the deep darkness of the dirt. Okay, and then condensing that into a more succinct kind of, I might kind of further write what that means to me, or consider like why I like that. Then that gets condensed into the instruction, rise up or uprising. So the following questions here are really meant to not just encourage and inspire kind of different ideas for how that might express itself in a class, but also just to kind of bring some more dimension to your own understanding or reflection on that central idea. You know, sometimes I'll take a class and the theme is like, I might read the quote at the beginning of class, put it down, you know, teach the class, read the quote again at the end of class. And if the class has been effective, the correlation between what you've just experienced somatically and what, you know, the central idea is likely made pretty clear. Okay. At other times, those links are made more explicit. So the first question here is macro metaphorical. And, you know, as someone that loves metaphor and that is constantly contemplating the interconnection of all these ideas, this is an invitation to consider, like, how does this particular quote apply? How might this theme apply to life or to reality at the macrocosmic level? And that could be like in terms of the cosmos, if you're someone that knows a lot about astrology, like perhaps there's something going on in the stars that connects with that. In terms of just like physics and the way our universe operates, there could be, you know, some contemplation there about kind of the expansion of things, what that looks like. And macro doesn't necessarily have to apply to like the whole universe. It could just apply to life in general. So for me, you know, how this theme applies to life at the macrocosmic level is through this notion of, as the quote suggests, of how things grow. Ooh, yes. My friend Emily was saying there was an earthquake up in NorCal or in Nevada recently. That like, okay, so sometimes the earth quakes and the earth shakes in order to allow for growth, in order to allow for expansion, which can be scary and which can feel, you know, terrifying if you've ever experienced an earthquake, which I've experienced many. So for me, that the theme was kind of experience macro through the notion of a seed, right? And a seed gets kind of buried deep into the dirt, into the soil, or, you know, the seed of you got buried into the embryo, right? There's sort of a bearing down, a movement into darkness. That is the precursor to life. And that in order for growth to happen, really at every layer, we must kind of overcome and develop the restlessness and the energy, the desire, and the ability to overcome resistance in order to break free and to expand and to grow. Okay, so that particular quote was quite easily riffed upon for me because I was experiencing that in my life. And I was also like, at the time, I was literally sitting in my living room looking at all of my plants and watching some new seedlings kind of start to grow. That was exciting for me. So watching seeds grow. Along those lines, you know, I know for a lot of us that have been trying to shift our teaching online and create new opportunities, new outlets for us to connect with our community, that requires the planting of a lot of seeds, right? This workshop that we're doing right now was a seed that was planted for me several months ago that is now growing. And you know, in full transparency, like hasn't been the easiest process. Like there's a lot of work and resistance and discomfort and kind of pushing through that needs to happen to emerge and to be able to manifest. Next question asks micro metaphorical. Right? So how might this theme apply to life or to reality on the microcosmic level? And depending on how you think about this question, you might kind of apply the macro and the micro in similar ways, right? Like the individual seed of the individual plant, or this notion of even like how thoughts manifest, right? You could say that the idea for something is like a seed. And when the idea emerges for you, when the idea occurs to you, it can either be kind of watered and nourished and it can grow, or it can be malnourished and it can be shot down through, as saying earlier, those voices of the inner critic that can come in and kind of, mitigate the growth of the idea and stop it before it has a chance to reach maturation. So micro and macro are somewhat interchangeable, but we can look on different layers of reality, like how things grow, both in the physical and in the subtle, is sort of through this ability to water and nourish the seeds of growth and to see them through the difficult times of resistance. This next question, I will kind of come back to this and talk a bit more about it after we go through the worksheet, because this question in particular really formed a lot of my organization around this particular class. I say developmentally, how might this theme apply to our progression through the stages of human development or human movement development? Now, depending on your familiarity with developmental movement, you may or may not have a lot of answers here, but I would encourage you to kind of reflect on your own life. Where you might not have early memory of this, but where did your development start? Right, it started as an infant on the floor, and now look at you, yogi that you are, standing on your hands and not just able to kind of embody these practices, but now teaching them to others. Like there's been a clear progression of your skills, of the seeds that have been planted for you throughout your life, and how might this particular theme, or how might any theme, kind of find application or find a corresponding movement through the stages of your life or our lives as humans. We'll talk a little bit more about these developmental stages, but spoiler alert, they correlate with what we talked about yesterday in terms of positional regressions and progressions. Then personally, how does this theme connect presently to your life? So in the case of this theme, you may already kind of shared, but I, along with all of us, was and still am essentially sheltering in place at home and feeling kind of the restlessness of both really wanting to well, for me, anytime I'm sort of told to stay put, anytime I'm sort of forced to anchor myself in one location for long enough, I start to develop a desire to break free. I think that's true for all of us to a certain extent, and maybe some of us more so than others. But I was experiencing, truthfully at the time of recording this, I was experiencing stress. And that stress, I realize now, was a manifestation of sort of my animal body being given the signal and the message over and over and over again that the world outside was not safe, that other people were not safe, that it was dangerous to breathe the air, that I was potentially toxic. Like these were, whether, regardless of maybe what you believe or now kind of subscribe to about what we're going through, that was the signal that I was sort of subconsciously being subjected to all the time. So when I would step outside, it was, mask on, like fully guard myself from my environment. And that was producing a feeling of stress, right? Of fear in my body. what often happens when our body produces fear or produces a stress response is that we are kind of infused with the adrenaline needed to either run away from the danger, or fight and defend ourselves against the danger. And in this instance, I and all of us were being told, stay home. You can't go anywhere. You can't run and you can't fight. And so as a result, I was just sort of basking in a sort of restlessness, a desire to break loose, to fight, to expand, to grow. And that restlessness, was uncomfortable. So personally, this class was my desire to express that and to move along those currents that were going on within me in an experiential way that I could facilitate with others. So quite personally, that's where I was at during the creation of this class. And what's one of the reasons why, besides just the logistics of teaching, that I chose to practice this class with everybody, because it was very much where I was myself too, and I wanted to go on this journey with everyone. Okay, and that likely connects to the next question: how might this theme relate to events and experiences that are unfolding within your local or global community? During times like we're living in now, where such large global events are being felt by everyone. I've heard like COVID referenced as sort of like the great equalizer, the great unifier, because no matter where you are in the world, you have some relationship with this. And so I made the assumption in this case that everybody that was tuning in was experiencing that to some degree or another. I don't want to make the broad assumption that the whole world is going through the same thing I am. And certainly if you're teaching in a local community, you're going to have kind of perhaps a better sense of what's going on within the community than if you're teaching a class that's being broadcast to the whole world. But the circumstances that we're in and are rare, in that we're all likely unified by our affiliation with these current events. So that's where that came from. Next question asks about the subtle realm. How is this theme experienced in the subtle or the pranic body? Okay, so to a certain extent, all the questions that we've been looking at so far kind of relate to like naming the theme, identifying the theme, making it universal, right? So how does this theme kind of apply in a more universal sense to what's going on in the world? Allowing the theme to become more personal. How does it apply to me personally? And then now we start to kind of turn and leverage the theme in the direction of, say, our personal embodiment, right? So this is kind of where the yoga practice starts to kick in and ask us to connect this theme to our tissues, connect it to our breath, connect it to the kind of interoceptive inner experience of our embodiment. Okay, so subtly, how is this theme expressed in the subtle or pranic body? Couple different directions that could take. I chose to take the direction of breath. And so my understanding of how it is that we breathe is that we have vocal cords, we have our glottis in our throat that opens to allow for air, for atmospheric pressure to move into our lungs. And then kind of through the expansion and contraction of our diaphragm, that atmospheric pressure, I'm being asked to make myself big. I'm big. The atmospheric pressure, or rather the diaphragm contracts to then push that pressure out. So the valve at the top of our trunk essentially can open or close to either allow air to move in and out of our lungs, or it can narrow to either produce sound or to block the passage of air, or to create kind of a whisper or different modulations of breath. Perhaps it's an aside. I don't know if I mentioned this in the class. I also had recently purchased, or I was gifted, an Instant Pot. And I've been making meals every week in my Instant Pot pressure cooker, which has like the valve on the top that releases all this pressure. So I was also thinking about that and thinking about like that pressure that is used to cook things at a fraction of the time in the Instant Pot. Hopefully this is relatable. That pressure can be used to actually to transmute and to cook and to create something. Yeah. And then you can push on the valve to release that pressure so that then you can enjoy what you've made. So all that was to suggest that by consciously invoking resistance and by consciously kind of utilizing our intrinsic pressure valves, we can cook ourselves and grow ourselves and develop that potency needed to evolve and to expand. Yes, such a great gift indeed. So in terms of prana, the pranayama practice that correlates most notably to that is the practice of ujjayi. Right? Meaning upward, jayi meaning sort of a victory. My interpretation of ujjayi pranayama, both kind of physiologically and metaphorically, is that pressure that we create by narrowing our vocal cords kind of limits the passageway of air from the atmosphere into our lungs and vice versa, where it creates sort of a back pressure that builds up heat and that builds up kind of restlessness, right? That ultimately produces sound and then has various effects on our nervous system and the support of our trunk as it moves through space. But I wanted to make use of ujjayi as a further metaphor of this concept of uprising. Quite literally, ujjayi means uprising or a victorious uprising. So that link was pretty clear for me. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the next question. Asks, how is this theme experienced in the physical body through practice? Okay. And as with all these questions, they're open to interpretation. But just in light of what we've already experienced this weekend, how many of you in one or more of these classes have experienced some degree of heat, some degree of sensory richness, some degree of soreness, some degree of challenge, of hands raised? Yes, me. Okay. I see you. This idea of being sort of opposed by force, being opposed and stoking kind of the frictive aspects of our practice can be uncomfortable. And for anybody, I'm sure this is true for a lot of us, like when folks will say to you things like, oh, like, of course you can do that. Look at you, like you can do this pose, you can do that pose. I'm not like you, like you can do all these things that I can't do. And you often want to say, you have no idea what I've undergone to adapt and to grow and to move through the strong, powerful discomfort of growth in order to become who I am now. So we never want to like look out and assume that others that are living the lives potentially or bodies or have the skills that you yourself want, that it was easy for them. I mean, sometimes maybe it was, right? There's such thing as privilege, but like, for a lot of us, especially us yogis, like there's a lot of resistance that we move through in order to develop, in order to grow. And that's true not just of our practice, that's true of life in general. So how this is experienced in my physical body has been through my ability to acclimate to strong sensation, right? To feel strong heat, which often manifests as sweat and discomfort and messiness. And it's through that I have been able to, on a good day, like manifest the grace necessary to kind of emerge. Then the kind of physical thread is pulled on further and ask the question biomechanically, what actions or principles regarding force and movement might relate to this theme? Again, that's going to depend on your familiarity with this, but you might even say in this in particular, well, I'll say it in several different ways. So anything that provides opposing force, right, kind of relates in my mind to this idea of emergence, right? There's a force that's trying to go this way, the seed is trying to grow this way, and there's a force that's keeping it down this way. And so the more resistance that there is, the more compressive force there is pushing something down, the more strength this has to develop to contend with that compressive force and ultimately overcome it. So we talked about this in the isometric session, right? That like we can use these different forces to create opposition, and through that opposition, we can develop greater strength. Okay, so this idea that our yoga practice is about relaxation, it's about ease, it's about efficiency. Yes, I would say yes to all that. Our yoga practice is also about learning how to work with resistance, learning how to work with opposition, learning how to contend with, to yield into, to overcome, to move through resistance. I would say life itself in this wonderful dimension we live in is a lot about learning how to work with resistance. Okay, so biomechanic principle would suggest that strength is developed through our ability to encounter and contend with opposing force. So this theme also connects with the notion of tissue adaptation and how it is that we grow stronger. Okay, posturally, what poses connect to this theme? There's not a right answer for any of this stuff, and certainly with this, there isn't either. I made the choice to work towards back bends because I don't think it's a stretch, no pun intended, to consider that this concept of uprising, of lifting, of emerging, sort of contains with it this gesture of extension, this gesture of peeling open the front of our body, as opposed to kind of the seedling, which is wrapped and which is sort of folded in on itself. That could also connect kind of with embryology and developmental movements as well. When we're in utero, we're quite literally spiraled in on ourselves, and as we are born and come online, we slowly emerge and extend and expand. So I made the choice to riff on the theme of, or the postural category of back bends. And because I was wanting to take the journey from kind of supported floor positions to standing progressed positions, it was a pretty clear choice for me. Like there's not a lot of standing back bends, and certainly standing balancing back bends. So, if you ask me like, what's the first standing balancing back bend that comes to mind? Natarajasana was sort of the obvious choice. So I chose to work towards Natarajasana as a representation of the kind of apex of developmental movement from a supported position to a standing balancing position. Okay, style. What style or styles of practice might best connect with this theme? This question could be something that's already determined for you. So if you are teaching a vinyasa class and the theme, and you select a theme, then the style of class that you'll apply that to is a vinyasa class. In the case of this particular session that I taught, I had the luxury of choosing, Yoga International said you have an hour to do whatever you want. So sometimes when that's the case, it's wonderful. Other times it's overwhelming because like, just tell me what to do. Give me something. Either give me the theme, give me the type of class, give me the level, and it was do whatever you want. So I made the choice, for all the reasons I mentioned before, to approach this as sort of a somatically inspired progression through the different stages of human development, ultimately, moving in the direction of back bends. In terms of what style, like how I would describe that, I might say it was a somatically inspired class. But I don't know how I would define this as an exact style of class. And maybe you guys have some ideas. Okay. And then, not finally, almost finally, embodiment, right? So as a teacher, how can you best embody this theme? And I think, in going through all these questions, it's not to suggest that every single one of these questions needs to be talked about, right? If that was the case, then you would spend 20 minutes in the beginning of class just talking about all this stuff. And conceivably, you might lose your students if they came to move and to do something other than listen to you talk. Hopefully that's not the case for today's session. You got your movement out of the way and now you can listen to me talk. But I would say that perhaps the most potent thing that you can do as a teacher endeavoring to facilitate a theme is to yourself embody it, right? So what I mean by that is for example, if your theme is courage and you show up to teach class and you yourself are kind of experiencing insecurity, you say, the theme of today is courage. Thanks for coming. Do whatever you want if you want. Like, practice with me if you feel like it. It's not really going to convey the quality of that theme. And as I was saying, earlier in the session, one of the ways that I also kind of get out of my own head and get out of my own way as a teacher is through remembering that if I want to convey something, if I want to teach something, if I want to facilitate something for my students, I will be more effective at doing that if I myself am embodying that. Sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, when you teach, you're so confident. I would have had no idea that you were nervous when you were teaching that thing." And I say, well, I would not be effective at teaching if I was embodying nervousness. Right? I have to embody confidence so that I can effectively convey and teach what it is I'm trying to share to my students. So, it's even a teaching technique to present in a confident way so that you yourself can experience the security of what it is that you're learning. It's a little peek behind the curtain. Maybe I shouldn't be so transparent. But in the case of this class, what does it mean to embody uprising? Again, it connects with one of the reasons that I chose to make this more of a led practice and to go along the journey with you, because I really wanted to embody all of the stages of that along with you. So that's why the class started out a little bit more exploratory, right? I'm right there with you, kind of on the ground, face down. I'm in the dirt with you. And then my instructions, as the class kind of progressed, the instructions become a little bit more firm. The instructions become more emphatic. The movements become bigger movements. I start to present in a bigger way because I want to be on that journey with you. Which is to say that if the class was uprising and I have you lying face down in the beginning of class and I'm like yelling at you or trying to inspire you, that might not really be reflective of where we are in the journey. Likewise, if we're up in full Natarajasana and I'm sitting down and I'm, kind of a bit more reserved, that's not really the time for that. That's the time for me to be upright with you and reflecting the energy and the quality of what that pose and what that time in class sort of calls for. The final question here is inquisitive. So what questions could I ask of myself and of my students to encourage further reflection? So, sorry, I can't help but look at some of your comments here. As with everything that I teach, as I said before, I want to provide you with information. I want to, yes, I'd love to inspire you if that's possible. I'd love to educate and inform and entertain. But most of all, I want to provide you with an opportunity to reflect and to learn more about yourself. And I don't know you, and I don't know what it is that you need to know or what it is you need to learn. I like to believe that you possess the skills, the seeds, the tools to be self-reliant to your own growth and understanding. I can facilitate that by assisting you, by giving you time to reflect and to consider. And we'll talk in a moment about somatics and my limited understanding about somatics, but at least how it is I approach that process. And it really, is to suggest that instead of kind of giving a prescriptive approach to movement, do it this way, and this is what it is, but really to invite you to explore options, to try it this way, and then to try it this way, and then to give you time to notice what you notice, right? To receive what it is there is to receive from that experience, right? And so when I teach in this way, which is often the way that I choose to teach, I want to provide ample opportunity for you to not just do the thing, but also to take time to ask yourself those questions. Something that I know to be true about the way our brain works, which is quite an interesting piece of learning for me many years ago, is that our brain is called into action most potently when it's asked a question. Right? So if I ask you, what's 2 plus 2? Like, if I want you to think about the number 4, that's probably the best way to get you to think about the number 4. So say, think about the number 4. Say, what's 2 plus 2? Okay, that's going to get your brain wanting to answer that particular question. And so, along those lines, as it comes to kind of affirmations, questions like why are you so insecure? Like, there might be some interesting answers there, but if I asked you, what does it feel like to teach with confidence? Right, that actually might be a question that could lead to kind of a more productive trail of a series of events than asking you, like, what does it feel like to teach with insecurity? Okay, or perhaps we ask both. Reflect on this, and which feels better to you. Okay, so along those lines, all that is to say that a lot of these themes can be made more powerful and more relevant and more potent in the experience of the students when they're framed as a question, and when you offer time for your students to reflect on what it means to them. Okay, so for this particular theme, a question along the lines of, where in your life do you feel like there is the restlessness of something trying to emerge, and how could you water those seeds in a way that they can emerge victorious and they can grow more beautifully in your life? That might be somewhat of an elaborate question, but these kind of methods of inquiry can also leverage into the section of class where we often invite our students to set an intention, or even on the back end of class as you kind of take what you've learned and continue to reflect on it. Hope that makes sense. So you're welcome. I'm happy to share my transparency. We're all in this together for sure. Okay, so again, the question around inquiry is really, I've taken a lot of classes focused on theming where the teacher kind of says, like, the theme of today is courage, and where in your life could you use some more courage? And that's kind of it. That's sort of all you get. And that would be kind of identification of the theme and inquiry, and then now let's practice together. And that all might be fine and good, but the purpose of this worksheet is to give you a little bit more dimensionality, a little more dimension around your own relationship with the theme, so that if you do choose to say the theme of today is uprising, where in your life are you feeling the restlessness of something trying to emerge, that there's more in there for you too. There's more that you're bringing to the table than just kind of, here it is, and now it's on you. Okay, so let's go back to this screen and go through these next few questions. So the next series of questions is where you can start to leverage this theme into a class and into a sequence. I'm not really giving you sequencing parameters here because depending on the type of class you're choosing to teach, of course, you might follow varying templates or varying approaches. I'll go a little bit into my approach to planning this class in just a moment. So here you have a place to write down the theme itself. That could be the quote, that could be the kind of title of class. Of course, time of the class, postural focus, it's backbends. Action principle. This class didn't really follow a particular action principle, but I was interested, I would say kind of somatics here, because my interest in this was exploring options. as one of you commented, a recursive kind of element of this class was letting our movements be informed by our eyes, right? And by our relationship to our environment and our desire to explore our environment. So we started kind of face down, looking, face down in the dirt, so to speak. And I held you there for probably a little longer than I normally would have, because I wanted you to want to lift up. I wanted you to want to get up off the ground. I wanted to hold you there long enough that restlessness would build, so that then, when I give you the invitation to look up and to look in front of you, you can experience, by contrast, how expansive that can be to just lift your head up and look forward, right? Different than me sort of saying, engage your upper back and tone through your abdomen and, engage your neck flexors and lift your sternum. Like, I wasn't really giving you instructions about how to align. I was giving you instructions on where to explore with your eyes and let that inform your movement patterning. The level of this class was all levels. The props needed for this particular class was, I think I just used a blanket, rolled up blanket, and a mat. But I think I also said the mat is optional, so just a blanket. Did a little brief myofascial work on the thighs. Okay, so then the various sections of class. How will you choose to introduce the class and share this theme with your students? You can refer to the class you just took to see the choice I made. In this particular instance, I made the choice to talk for a little bit of time. Part of that was just logistically getting everybody arrived and settled, and myself included, making sure like I was live and that everyone was there and everyone had what they needed. But I spent a good, 5 minutes or so talking about the theme. Don't always do that, but in this class it felt appropriate. The next section, pranayama and centering. How might you connect to this theme through breath and inner awareness? So I gave a little explanation about Ujjayi pranayama, but really the class didn't necessarily begin with like a seated intention centering, I don't think. I believe we started pretty much right away face down, and we did the pranayama practice face down. Right? So I wanted us not to kind of envelop the class with let's say intention and context, but really to dive right in and experience it relative to the movement journey we were on. And then, like, no big deal, sequence, plan your sequence. So what's the sequence? And then on the back end, how might you summarize the theme and practice into a meaningful takeaway as you wrap up class and transition back to life? Okay, so that might look like if you finish class with an om, if you finish with sort of a blessing, if you finish with kind of one final question for the students. I mean, this could even be posed back to them. Consider how you can allow your experience in this class to inform what comes next. Or even the invitation for me is often to suggest that just because the class is over doesn't mean it's over, right? You're still going to get up from this class and do the next thing. Like the next thing in the sequence is whatever you do next. And that process of unfolding and emerging and rising up is going to continue even once the boundary of class is finished. So just kind of the invitation to continue to reflect on this particular theme as you transition from this part of the sequence into the next part of your sequence, so to speak. Okay, we made it. So that's that. I'm going to look at some of what you guys have written here before we move on. Did the same, having us follow our hand back with our eyes to ease us into the mouth. Yes. Okay. So, I hope you find, as with all this, I hope you find that useful. I hope you find these questions interesting and stimulating as you kind of pull on threads of various themes. And what I will say is that with all these worksheets, and with so much of what we do, right, if we can apply a process to something enough times, then the process can start to be integrated in just our natural modes of consideration. So, I don't necessarily pull out the worksheet and fill in the worksheet every time I teach a class, but I've done this enough times. I've created countless pose inventory worksheets and countless sequences so many times that when it comes time for me to actually do it, it's just the way my brain tends to think about these things now, right? And so my whole life is a sequencing, theming worksheet, because I'm constantly, learning something and then thinking about how that applies to micro, macro, personal embodiment practice. Like that's just the way that I engage with life at this point. So, disclaimer, do this enough times and you kind of can't go back. It just becomes the way that you'll start to see, to see your choices, to see your movements, to see life itself. So that sounds like an exciting prospect. Then I recommend going through the process. Yeah, and again, with all this stuff, it's useful to then go back, now that we've kind of talked about it, go back and not just look for the clues, but look for evidence of this process playing out for me in the class itself. So what I want to talk a little bit about in the time that we have is sort of this concept of somatic movement, somatic training, somatics, and developmental movement, and just share with you some of what's been really impactful for me in terms of kind of restructuring my approach to considering what my role is as a teacher and what it is that I'm actually teaching through these practices. Yeah. Show of hands, who has studied somatics, let's say, or has any experience or background in somatics? Okay, 25 of you. So I always like to give the disclaimer before I dive into particular areas of study where I'm not necessarily a certified instructor, that my experience with somatics is both personal, in that like I'm a human with a body and with somatic experiences, and my influences are pretty diverse. So the kind of innovators and primary influencers in the world of somatic movement that I'm aware of would be like Moshe Feldenkrais, Lamont Bartenieff, movement modalities, movement analysis, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's body-mind centering, Alexander technique. There's a lot of different access points into the world of somatics. I am not a teacher of any of those modalities. So my approach is sort of a hybrid of what I've learned from many different individuals. I mentioned, so often I'm giving a shout out to my friend, Trina Altman, just because she's a wonderful human, an incredible teacher, and someone who's been a big influence on me. But the week before I taught this class, I was doing a morning practice series on my Instagram Live, where I was doing a morning kind of sadhana practice and inviting different teachers on. And I think I actually made mention of it in the class itself, but Trina came on and taught a 20-minute or so somatic movement warm-up on my Instagram to myself and to my followers, which looked like the first probably 5 or 10 minutes of this class. So something that I'm often doing, if I experience something and it's interesting to me, which that was, I'll riff on it. So I did that practice with Trina, and it was a lot of the prone movement, lifting the elbow and lifting the head and exploring different options there. And I thought, well, how could that continue? How could I continue to progress this and ultimately take this into a fuller style practice? So that was part of what inspired at least the starting point to this particular sequence. And I'm always as transparent as I can about where my influence come from, and that so many of these movements are out there, are available, and they live in our own body. So what a wonderful thing that we can riff on them and play with them in different ways. Yeah, thanks, Trina. So I'll just share a little bit about kind of how my understanding of somatics has influenced my own teaching and my own approach, there's debate, I would say, or conversation to be had around whether or not our yoga practice is a somatic practice. And I think it depends on how you approach it, right? So if your yoga practice is a form of physical training, meaning if I was trying to get you to perform Natarajasana in a very specific way, with the alignment points just so, and with your body kind of in a particular organization, and I was going through the steps to kind of train your mobility to be able to manifest that shape. That may or may not kind of be a somatically informed exploration of that particular pose. That might fall more kind of under the realm of like training. My understanding of somatics is, essentially when we approach something from more of a somatic perspective, I'm inclined to ask questions. Okay, and those questions might sound something like, what happens if, right? So instead of telling you that this is the way to do it, I could say, what happens if you try it this way? What happens if you try it this way? Okay, and then giving you a chance to notice, right? Notice what it is you notice about the movement. Sometimes I'll encourage or provide opportunity for students to experience different types of movement, and then when I ask them, to notice what they notice, they'll say, "Oh, that reminded me of." I think one of you is on the call who comes to mind. That reminded me of being a kid in like a field of lilacs and like playing in the field with my siblings. Like there was just some memory locked away in our tissues that is awakened through movement. It's like you can smell something and it brings back a full download of a memory of some experience that you had that connects with that sensation. So in the same way, our movements can be very much reminiscent of or invoke different memories that are contained within ourselves. So when I teach from this vantage point, which is often, I really want to provide opportunity for students to try things in different ways and to have the reflective experience of noticing, whether there's a preference to do it one way versus the other, if there's an emotion that comes up in response to doing something in a particular way, and if there's something that they learn about their own body and the way that their body organizes movement by exploring options. So I'll put that up here as well. So oftentimes in the practice of somatics, instead of kind of prescribing the option or prescribing the way to do something, we're encouraging exploration around how it is, the different options we have to do something. As I said yesterday, I'm more interested in increasing your options than I am in limiting them. And sometimes the way that we create discernment between options is by limiting them. So let's take some of these things off the table so that we can really dive into these other things. But then let's take those things off the table and let's dive into these other things so that we really have discernment, but also a sense of liberation around the ways that we can self-organize and the options that we have. When I teach in this way, and this is what I believe in the title of this session, I'm often looking to discover new pathways of movement. You'll notice in this particular class, there's quite a lot of kind of interesting transitions that are mapped from prone position, kind of rolling to get to a seated position, extending into a back bend, coming back down, kind of rolling to get to a quadruped position and back to like a child's pose, or coming up right into a seated position and standing. And personally, those movements are not informed by anything other than my own exploration. So when I planned this class, I spent a good hour or so on the ground rolling around and looking for different pathways, looking to discover how my body could find its way from one movement into the next. And in many instances, I would find multiple pathways, multiple options. And those options can be distinctly different. Those options can be subtle. Even in the beginning of class, like as you go to lift your head up off the floor, does that come from pushing into the floor? Or does that come from lifting yourself up into the floor? Oh, yes. P.S. Trina is a teacher on the Yoga International platform. So how convenient for you that you can experience all of her wonderful classes as I can right here on YI. So, I don't have a formula to kind of give you all of these pathways and show you them. Of course, the more classes that you take that expose you to them, the more kind of movements you'll have in your repertoire. But it really takes a certain level of discovery and of curiosity and of creative play to kind of discover and map these different progressions, these different pathways in your own body. I'll give you in a moment some kind of guidelines, but ultimately it's a process of creative exploration that leads to these discoveries. Oftentimes when I'm working within a somatic paradigm, I'm interested in moving along the various developmental stages of movement for many reasons, but there are several fold. One is that in the somatic movements, I want them to more or less be gentle movements, right? If we're going to explore different options, I want to regress quite heavily the risk, or regress the load, or regress sort of the intensity of the movement, so that there can be some freedom in exploring different options without needing to say, like, choose the option that's going to be the most, the least risky or the least dangerous. For example, if I'm standing upright and holding onto a kettlebell, I might want to kind of minimize the options in terms of the pathway so that it can be organized most effectively through my body, those pathways of weight, so that I can sustain that action. Whereas if I'm on the floor and I'm rolling around on the floor, I'm going to have a lot more leeway, a lot more freedom in the options that I explore, because the risk is mitigated and is minimized, right? I'm not overloading the action. I'm not progressing the load. So many of the more somatically inspired classes that I teach are going to I'm seeing all the plugs and promos here, are going to start in a pretty regressed position and really kind of unfold from there. Now, this entire class, I would say, was not all kind of a somatics class by any means. I said somatically inspired, because in some instances we were doing some specific drills and some specific movement training, and in other instances I was giving you the option to explore. And typically, the closer we are to the ground, the more regressed the movement. That's where I'm going to create more freedom and more option for discovery and for inquisition around kind of what happens if. Okay. So kind of zoom out a little bit here and just give some definition around somatics. There's a lot of different ways that somatics can be defined. I've heard a lot of very interesting and stimulating definitions around somatics. The definition actually that's on Wikipedia says, somatics is a field within bodywork and movement studies which emphasizes internal physical perception and experience. The term is used in movement therapy to signify approaches based on soma meaning the body as it's perceived from within. This includes, as I said before, Alexander technique, the Feldenkrais method, Rolfing structural integration, etc. In dance, the term refers to techniques based on the dancer's internal sensations, in contrast with the performative techniques, such as ballet or modern dance, which emphasize the external observation of movement by an audience. Somatic techniques may be used in bodywork, psychotherapy, dance, or spiritual practices. So, in many ways, the way that I learned yoga, and the way I think a lot of us learn yoga, is by seeing a picture of somebody doing a particular pose and then attempting to recreate the aesthetic that pose. We talked about this in the session earlier, just in reference to chaturanga. A lot of the instructions or the alignment points that we're encouraged to adopt in our practice are informed based on the way the pose might look, or based on the aesthetic outcome of the pose. And while there may be an aspect of that that's beautiful, I love the artistry of yoga and creating beautiful shapes. When I approach my practice from more of a somatic vantage point, I'm less interested in what it looks like. I'm less interested in the result of the shape that I'm in. I'm more interested in the inner experience. And that might have a corresponding kind of expression that looks like something, right? In fact, as I said before, a lot of how I initially was introduced to these concepts was through movement classes in college and contemporary dance, right, which is about learning how to express, which is less about what it looks like and more about what it feels like, what comes through you. Okay, so the somatic practices really shift the intention away from the external performative aspects of what something looks like and really shift it inwards to what it feels like and the experience of the practitioner, the experience of the mover. Okay, so the definition that kind of works most effectively for me, or at least the qualifiers of somatic movements, besides kind of the approach, would be that the movements in and of themselves are relatively gentle, right? Gentle movements that explore options for the purposes of creating a shift, right? A shift in our perception, a shift in our awareness, a shift in our nervous system, right? Some shift, some internal shift that can likewise lead to new habits. And the new habits don't necessarily need to be better habits, but new habits, right? So all of our movements, because of the progression of our life, right? All of our movements are informed by some starting point. The starting point for a lot of us is our childhood and the developmental stages that we move through to progress to who we are now. And so, it can sometimes seem a little adjacent to our movement practices to get on the floor and roll around and explore some developmental movements again. But to a certain extent, it's those heavily regressed versions of what we now do as fully formed adult humans that form the basis of what so much of our movement habits are. So by regressing our movements and kind of taking them back to a more fundamental place and exploring different options and creating shifts in our nervous system and shifts in our perception, shifts in our awareness, we can start to not only become aware of what our habits are, but we can start to develop new habits in our movement practices. So that's sort of the extent to which I qualified to speak to somatics, but you can see how that might play out in my teaching and the teaching of others, certainly, depending on the modality, depending on the individual. But very different approach to say, yesterday's practice where it's do this in a particular way, press here, engage here. I'm working to map a particular habit versus a class like the one that we just took, where we're exploring some different options. And in many instances, you'll notice the option that's being explored is one that I will say connects to the environment. Okay, so I didn't choose to offer too many alignment points in the particular class, but I really wanted to connect the movements that you were doing to your desire to see, to look. It's one of the reasons we're using our eyes so much in this particular class, right? The way that it is that we learn movement as infants, the way that we are inspired to get up off the floor and to move, is not because somebody teaches us how to engage our quadriceps, or someone teaches us how to engage our back muscles, or someone shows us how to wrap our inner thighs towards our outer hips, or we don't learn movement often in the way that we're taught or that we teach movement as yoga practitioners. We learn to move because we want to get up off the ground. We want to explore our environment, and we want to grab that thing and pull it towards us, or get over to where that thing is so we can investigate it more fully. We learn to twist because we want to see what's behind us. And, when I try to connect my classes in a more functional way to how it is that we learn motor learning skills, that's often something that I'm considering, right? To not sort of bog my classes down with alignment points, but really to connect the movements that we're practicing to the environment in which we're practicing, to our desire to see, to look, to grab, to interact, to connect, and to relate to the space around us. So let me finish this by kind of showing you guys some of the developmental movements that informed this particular class. And I do have some other classes on the platform that sort of riff on this a little bit. To a certain degree, all of them do. If you think of like even a typical vinyasa class, and much of what we talked about yesterday, when we're going through positional progression, starting from the floor to crawling, to sitting, to kneeling, to standing, that is a reflection of our positional progressions relative to our developmental movements. So, it's no accident that I'm wanting kind of the process of unfolding in a class to somewhat reflect how it is we unfold as humans. And to that extent, the class is sort of a somatic investigation of how it is we map movement. So, I believe the class Serena, maybe you can post it. I have a class on the platform called, I want to say, Spinal Awakening. It's a class that explores the movements of the spine, and we explore them through kind of a somewhat, heavily regressed, but through kind of tracing the movements from our infancy to our adulthood. Karen asked, might you comment on introducing an element of play as a means to explore somatically? Your YI session block party is, for me, an example of this. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I think play is a key feature of all life. That how I learned a lot of my movements as a kid was through play. You're on the playground and you see somebody do something that looks fun, and you say, I want to do that too. And so you try to figure it out. Something else that's a common feature of somatically inspired classes. This is a big feature, as far as I'm aware, of the Feldenkrais method, is through the solving of movement puzzles, which really speaks to what I was just referring to about eyesight. Right? We learn to move because there's a problem that we want to solve that movement requires us to solve. Right? If I want to get from where I am to over there and I'm on the floor, there's quite a lot of problems I have to solve, puzzle I have to solve to figure out how I'm going to get there. Right? So, as adult yogis, we might be inspired to move because we want to kind of be good yogis or be evolved humans or get it right or stay out of pain or stay healthy and strong. But I think play is a necessary and useful component to introduce into the ways that we move, because it very much is a part of the creative process of solving these puzzles, so to speak, that are required for us to evolve and step out into our world and live our lives. Further, life is one big puzzle, if you haven't noticed. Just even learning how to use Zoom so you can teach your classes is a puzzle that needs to be solved. And a lot, I think, as we get older, and even as we're younger to a certain extent, but as we get older, these puzzles can become more and more serious, and the stakes can feel higher and higher and higher. And we can approach them more and more and more from this place of stress and overwhelm. So just from the perspective of wanting to be effective in the learning of skills, if I can associate that skill with playfulness as opposed to stress, I think that you'll be more apt to learn the skill. Further, if you look at an infant who's learning to walk, they spend a lot of time falling over. They spend a lot of time messing it up. They spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, or holding on to something, or crying, or wobbling, toppling, getting back up again. So messing up is also a big part of how we learn particular skills. And I think the way that I was taught to teach yoga, the way that I learned yoga was to sort of minimize the margins of error and to depend really heavily on the instruction of the teacher so that I got it right. I have friends and people that practice with me or want to practice with me because they think that if they practice with me, I'll make sure that they do it right. And they're often a little baffled to come and take my class and find that sometimes I'll demonstrate something and then I'll say, okay, try to figure it out. And then I'll give them lots of time and they'll say, aren't you going to teach me how to do it? And I'll say, yes, but first try to figure it out on your own. And permission to suck, permission to fall, permission to mess it up. That's going to be part of the process for you too. And if you can engage in that in a playful way, or in a curious way, treat this as a puzzle to solve in your body, not something to get right so that you get the benefits of it. It feels a little bit counterintuitive based on how I was trained to teach and what the mark of a good teacher was for me in my past. But the more that I've come to understand about motor learning skills and even reflect on my own process of learning movements, the more it makes sense to frame my classes as an opportunity to explore, to ask questions, to get it wrong, to try again, to play, to try it different ways, to explore options. Not always, but for the most part, that is the approach that most appeals not only to my sentiments but also to my understanding. So hope that answers that. So here you are, you're a baby, and you're born, and splat, there you are. This mat, because typically you're not born on a mat. And before your musculature has come online, you don't really have the capacity to do much from this regressed position to get yourself up off the floor. Okay, but if you were to, it would require kind of the engagement of your some of the muscles in your chest, in your shoulders, in your arms to lift your limbs up off the floor, right? Or to bend your knees and draw your legs into your chest. So there is sort of the development of strength along our limbs and along our trunk that allows us to start to progress and open these chains from our arms to our legs. If you have a baby, I don't, but I've been told that parents are encouraged to give their kids tummy time, which means putting them in a prone position as opposed to a supine position. One of the reasons being it's difficult for a baby to roll over from their back onto their belly. And the strength that they're going to develop first will likely be posterior strength to lift themselves off the floor as opposed to anterior strength. Right? So our back body is going to have more capacity to lift us up as newborns than the front chain of our body. So this particular class started with tummy time. The head of a newborn is about 1/4 of their body weight, as opposed to an adult, which is I think around 1/8 of their body weight. So it's pretty big. And that means it requires quite a bit of force on the back of the neck, upper back, to lift one's head up. And that lift comes, much like in this class, from the desire to see. Right? A baby placed on their belly maybe can turn their head side to side. But to see what's in front of them, they have to develop the strength to lift their head. That strength comes as a combination of both pushing into the floor and leveraging what's called ground reaction force. So as I push into the floor pushes into me and I rebound up. And also the tensile force to the back of my neck that lifts my head up. So we explored that in this particular class, both lifting and pushing to get your head up off the floor. Once our head can lift off the floor, we can start to turn and look in different directions, which starts to build strength on the two hemispheres of the body, right? So I can start to rotate and turn and look and see more of what's in front of me. And of course, what happens as you look and see what's in front of you is you realize, there's a lot of things out there that you might want to go and get. And so the next stage, of course, there's sort of a rolling stage that can happen, right? We can start to shift our weight. And then there's a stage where we develop the capacity to reach and to grab and to pull towards us. Right? I can grab this thing, I can grab that thing. Okay. As my ability to reach and grab comes online, as my ability to roll and shift starts to unfold, then here I am able to potentially start to locomote and pull myself and push myself, guys, push myself into different parts of my environment. Okay, so I can start to move and crawl. I'm going through these. There are many other nuanced stages, but as it relates to this class, there's sort of the prone section, the head lifting section, the reaching and pulling section, the reaching, pulling, rolling section, and reaching, pulling, and kind of crawling section. Now, we didn't locomote so much in this class, but we did some simulated crawling through these variations of what I call crawling cobra, crawling up dog. Now, in order to get up off the ground, of course, I can roll myself. In order to start to get up off the ground and progress further, I need to develop the ability to pull my legs underneath me. So that's going to be a combination of pushing into the floor and pulling through my core and through my legs to get up into a quadruped or a crawling position. Once I'm in a quadruped position, then I can progress and open these chains and use that to crawl. Hope this is entertaining for you guys. If you want a glimpse into what I look like as a baby, something like this. Okay. Once I'm able to crawl, then I can kind of push and sit. Okay, so we go from crawling to sitting. The process of getting upright is usually accompanied by some pulling, right? So you might grab onto something, a countertop or mom or dad or whatever it might be, maybe something you shouldn't go into, and combine that pulling action through your arms with a pushing action through your legs to get up into a kneeling position. Okay? And it's really in this stage that, the spinal awakening class talks about the development of the spine and when the various curves of the spine come online relative to these positions. Of course, we get a spinal extension, lifting off the ground. There's rotation and lateral bending as we start to roll and crawl. There's spinal flexion that we learn to stabilize as we push into the floor. And then the lumbar curve comes online and it rather stabilizes as we render ourselves upright. And then there's kind of the wobble of taking one leg forward, pushing into the floor, pulling to bring ourselves upright. And then, of course, we fall, we regress, and we repeat many, many, many times over. So again, in kind of going back through the sequence of class, you'll see that the various stages, kind of going from a prone position to a crawling position, to a seated position, to a kneeling position, right, to a standing position, and back, were explored in many different ways and many different iterations throughout the arc of that class. Now, I wasn't seeking to mimic, as babies, we don't necessarily do a shin box or a tripod shin box with these movements that we did in class. But the approach was really to mimic those various stages and to approach them in a way that connects our relationship with our environment, looking at our arm, right, exploring options, so that we could likewise kind of participate in that process of unfoldment, of unfolding, of emerging, and of quite literally rising up. Then, of course, the downward arc of class brings us back to where we started. And every class sort of ends with the somatic peak pose, Shavasana. Right? So what is life? Oh, good. what is life other than one big somatic exploration, right? To experience force, to experience reality, to experience consciousness in a physical, tactile way, in a body, in a mind, in a heart, is a somatic experience. That experience ends with death. And I can't, perhaps speaking to what comes after life is beyond the scope of this weekend's sequencing course, but perhaps at the end of all of it, there's a chance to notice what you noticed about being alive and to reflect on the experiences that you held in your body, in your tissues, in your awareness, and to allow that to process as you move into whatever comes next. So, we engage in that symbolically with Shavasana, which, whether you tend to fall asleep in Shavasana, whether you tend to have the experience, whatever it is for you, Shavasana looks like. If it's like at a really deep Shavasana or a very interesting Shavasana, it's an opportunity to notice what you notice from the effect of having moved your tissues, shifted your nervous system, and explored these new habits, these new choices that can inform whatever comes next. So with that, I will wrap this session and say thank you guys so much for being on this somatic, curious, baffling, interesting journey with me. I'm going to stay on for a little bit of time to answer questions. I'm sure there's plenty of them. If you have questions, I'll post in the Facebook group some additional resources if you want to learn more about somatics. I think someone had asked about some of the different modalities that I mentioned. I'll post them in there. For those of you that are teachers of these various modalities, whether it's Feldenkrais or Laban, Martinieff, feel free to share the resources that you have. Certainly, as I'm quite transparent about the scope of my qualifications to speak to it, sort of end here. But certainly, you can see how I've taken what I've learned and leveraged that into meaningful sequences. And that's really what I'm here to teach you how to do. In terms of homework, if you would like additional homework, I will invite you to fill out the sequencing worksheet relative to a theme of your choice. So when it comes to theming, there's kind of little parameter that I have around the type of class that you teach or the type of class you put together. But I'll invite you to kind of, maybe there's been a quote that popped across your screen of reality in the last 24 hours that stuck out to you, or you saw something or read something, or you've been feeling something. I'll invite you to take some time and churn that through the process that I laid out on the sequencing worksheet. And as is the case for everything we've done thus far, if you would like to share that worksheet or share the sequence, feel free to do so in the Facebook group. And sometime next week, I'll go through and I'll be able to give feedback on a couple of these sessions. All right, let's see what some of these questions are. Okay, this is from Jewel. The isometric upper body drill sequence is not very accommodating for people with ample tissues. What's an alternative way to practice this in lieu of blocks at the center of the chest? Could 2 blocks under the shoulders work the same way? I would suggest instead of 2 blocks, you could use a bolster. And the blocks are really there to regress the range of motion, so you don't have to go all the way down to the floor. They're meant to help. So if they're hindering, then get rid of them. But you could certainly, instead of kind of positioning a block here and a block here, you could put a lengthwise bolster underneath you, and hopefully that provides a little bit more forgiveness in terms of the ladies. All right, from Lester. Hi, Lester. I have a question of linking breath to motion using the example from this class. While prone, is there a particular reason for your cueing to exhale as we rise the chest up? From the last live stream, I think you briefly mentioned that for pushing actions, that require effort, this makes sense to me. But in this particular class, it felt quite restricting in my body as I tried to rise up with an exhale. I find that as I exhale, the body seems to more naturally curl inward. Can we discuss this a little bit, please? Sure. This would be a good opportunity to explore kind of somatically. So actually, I'll invite you guys, if you want to do this with me, we can try it together. And that was a choice that I made, which was not to suggest that that's how it should be done. Okay, but let's try this a few different ways. So if you like, you can lie on your, I'm assuming you guys can hear me, right? Good. You guys lie on your belly and you can rest your forehead on the back of your hands. Just give yourself a moment to settle. And we're going to begin taking some movements into and out of sort of a modified Shalabhasana. So let's first try it on an inhale, and then we'll try it on an exhale. So press your tailbone down into the floor, down towards the floor. And as you inhale, lift your head up, lift your chest up. You can even lift your legs. And as you exhale, come back down. We'll just try that a few times. Inhale, lift up. Exhale, come down. Inhale, lift up. Exhale, come down. If you want to progress the movement, you can start to lift one of your hands up as you come up. So perhaps that hand that's touching your forehead stays connected to your forehead. Inhale, go up. Exhale, come down. If you want to progress further, you can lift both of your hands up as you inhale. Exhale, come down. Try one more time. Inhale, lift up. Exhale, come down and rest. Pause for a moment. You can switch the hand that's on top. And now let's try it with the reverse form of breathing. And again, notice what you notice. So from this position, press your tailbone down, breathe in. And as you exhale, lift your head up. And as you inhale, come down. And keep moving in that way. Exhale to come up. Inhale to come down. You can start to progress if you wish. On the exhale, you can lift one hand up with you. Inhale, come down. You could progress further. Exhale to lift both arms up. Inhale down. When you've had enough, rest. And give yourself a moment to process. And then bring yourself upright. So I'm more curious to hear from you all. You can put this in the chat box. What was your experience? So which perhaps felt easier? Which did you prefer? Did it feel the same? Did one feel not so great? Like which felt better in your body? Inhaling to lift or exhaling to lift? Felt easier for Lester to inhale and lift. For Adrian, it felt easier to exhale and lift. Anyone else do this with me? Inhaling to lift, but makes it familiar. Inhale to lift. I also like exhale to lift. Inhale was easier. Yeah, so this is Chiron. When I rise on an inhale, it feels like an opening. On an exhale, it activated the core. So, you know, the experience is somewhat split, right? For some folks, they're going to have a better experience exhaling to lift. For some, it'll be a better experience inhaling to lift. And that's good information to receive, right? So when we're thinking about teaching these classes, you say, well, what's the right way? What's the better way? What feels better for you might feel not as good for somebody else. So, when there's time and when we have the opportunity to explore like this, which we always do, it becomes useful to provide experiences like this. And this really is a great example of sort of a somatically inspired or informed exploration of teaching, where instead of teaching you how to lift, I'm essentially giving you an opportunity to learn more about yourself, to learn more about your habits, and to potentially explore some new ones. I always cue to exhale and lift into locust. Yeah, so in Light on Yoga, when Iyengar teaches Shalabhasana, he cues to lift on an exhale. Now, I wouldn't say one is better, one is worse. Even as it relates to kind of strength training, it's not that you always would exhale to exhibit force and inhale to modulate release. What I had said in the session earlier, maybe there was a misunderstanding. It's not that you exhale to push and you inhale to pull. It's that whenever there's the exhibition of force, so on the concentric phase, typically an exhale will help to organize the intra-abdominal pressure and help distribute that force. So in the case of Shalabhasana, when you lift up off the floor, that's actually the concentric phase. Your back body is shortening to lift you up. And then when you lower down, that's when you're modulating the release into gravity. So the breathing would be consistent with that kind of sentiment, that I would exhale to exhibit the force to lift and inhale to soften back down. So, typically exhales will help to exhibit power, inhales will help to modulate control. So in that, it kind of speaks to that, the difference between kind of leveraging your breath more kind of biomechanically to distribute force versus what the breath does sort of symbolically of the movement. So certainly Shalabhasana is more symbolic of an inhale, but it's also that the mechanics of the inhale is going to sort of widen everything and open everything, where actually in Shalabhasana, it's a shortening, it's a squeezing that pulls you up off the floor. So depends on how you organize it. For me personally, when I push into the ground to lift up, an exhale feels a little better. When I exhale to lift up, I don't necessarily get as much height, but I do feel more core stabilization. So I'm able to kind of create a more even arc in my back. I feel more supported, and it's different every day. So when in doubt, try it both ways. And I would say that if you guys have questions, put them in the Q&A box, because there's a lot going on over here in the chat box. My recommendation is always, when in doubt, try it both ways and then allow the student to reflect on their experience, right? It's one thing to teach somebody how to do something. It's another thing to teach them how to engage in the process of learning about themselves, right? So when you provide different options and then encourage them to reflect, as we just did, you're going to get a lot more information. Like if you read through these cues, like how interesting to get all these different bits of information. Now, some of that's going to be informed by, if you come from a particular lineage, like if you were taught by a teacher that said, always do it this way, this is the right way, there's a psychological component in that too, where to reverse the breathing might almost seem like sacrilegious, or it might even seem like you're going against the tradition that you learned. So, there's any number of things that can create friction or confrontation or even discomfort in our body that can be a result of just our familiarity, our context, and our beliefs. So I'm not here to say that's the case for you, but as always, there's more questions to ask, and there's a lot to consider when we kind of reflect on the choices we can make. But I'm often practicing with reversed, relative to what the baseline is, reversed breath, and noticing the benefits of one versus the benefits of other. So I get some things when I inhale, I get some things when I exhale, and vice versa. That helps. Okay, Laura, whenever I make it a point to sequence a class with a theme in mind, with a Dharma talk, and link the posture specifically to it, I get more positive feedback on those classes than any other class. However, I sometimes find it mentally exhausting to continue to plan and weave poses into classes together so well. How do you manage the planning of these classes so they aren't a huge time suck or a big mental weight? That's a good question. The first thing I would say is, if you're feeling, it's why I provide you with the worksheet. And like I said before, it's not to say that every class you teach, now go to that worksheet and fill in the worksheet. But I think, I will sometimes go through those worksheets or go through that particular worksheet, even when I'm not planning a class. And again, at this point, I kind of go through it in my mind because my own process that I'm putting on paper for you. But, I might read something on the news, or I might hear something in the world or get a quote, and my mind just starts to process in that way, so that I have a lot of different themes, a lot of different thematic ideas that are always kind of swirling around, that whether I speak to them or not are available to me. So I think if you don't do this process when you have to, but do it when you want to, it's going to kind of build a library, a catalog of ideas and of kind of process that you can pull on when you need it. Now, the other thing is just because you get good feedback from your students when you do that, I don't think that means that you then have to do it every time. Yes, if I teach a class where I offer a lot of hands-on adjustments, or which I don't do often, but if there's a lot of hands-on adjustments, or if there's a really fun playlist and there's a theme and there's all these different things, the student, if I do it well, the student's like, wow, that was a great class. There was a little bit of everything. And I'm like, oh shit, I gotta do that every time. So I really want to train my students' expectation that sometimes we're gonna work on a pose. Sometimes you're gonna come to class, we're gonna work on a pose. There's no music, I'm not gonna use touch. There's not an explicit theme, but trust that if I'm taking a lot of things off the table and I'm doing one thing, we're gonna do that one thing really, really well. So on the days where I'm not trying to do a lot of things at once, you're going to get a more potent lesson on one thing. And that's a beneficial day. That's a lucky day for you, because you're going to really invest in this particular skill. On other days, we're going to do more. There's going to be more elements at play. There's going to be more that I'm speaking to. And some people will love that. Some people won't. You can see even from the comments on this training, there are folks whose expectation is being met and exceeded, and there are folks who are like, when are we going to start talking about sequencing? So there's no way to please everybody, and there's no way to kind of adhere to the expectations that everybody has, but the feedback is useful. And if your students are telling you, I really love it when you do that, I would ask them more questions. What is it that you love about that? Maybe they just love it because on those days you're really inspired and they love to practice with you when you're feeling inspired. So if then you're like, oh shit, I got to do this every time, and then you feel bogged down, they're probably not going to love it as much because you're not feeling inspired on that day. So I hope that helps. I would say follow the trail of your interests. Don't force inspiration when you don't have it. But go through the process enough times that your brain will sort of be able to pluck and pull from these themes more effortlessly because of the training, so to speak, of what you've done. You've done behind the scenes. Okay. This is from Ben. In general, do you tend to create a class theme based on the direction of the poses you want to use, or do you create a class sequence based more on the theme you want to use? Or does it vary depending on the day? Basically, how do you normally start your class planning? Yeah, it's totally different for me. I'll say I don't teach really public drop-in classes anymore, even before, COVID, everything. I teach workshops and teacher trainings and online classes. And so it really just depends, right? So if I'm in a teacher training, oftentimes in a longer format teacher training, there will be modules, like say a 300-hour training with me will have different modules where one module we're going to focus solely on, let's say, alignment-based teaching or more anatomy-based teaching. One module is going to be focused on vinyasa. One module is going to be focused on theming. So in those modules, that's my starting point. It's easy for me to know the starting point because that's what we're working on. Same thing with this weekend. I know what the starting point is because if I'm teaching isometric strength series, my starting point are isometrics. And then if a theme kind of presents itself, I'll snatch that theme and kind of hold on to it. And maybe we'll talk about it. if the class is like, will you teach a class on Easter to everybody? I'm more inclined to start with a theme, because I'm not going to say that, well, everyone needs to do backbends. It's more like, well, what's going on? What is Easter about, and what's going on in the world right now, and how could I best leverage that into a class? So it really depends on what's inspiring me, what the context of what I'm teaching is. And I think in terms of having options, it's nice to be able to have different entry points into the process of class planning. Right? So if you always start with a theme and not often with a pose, if you always start with a pose and not often with a theme, I'd recommend trying it in different ways. It's why on those other worksheets that I've made, there is a section on the worksheet you'll notice that says theme. Because after you've done the whole worksheet and after you've kind of looked for the patterns and looked at what you're doing, you might see like, oh, there's sort of a clear theme that's unfolding. It might not start with even the theming worksheet. It might not start with the theme itself. It might start with a biomechanic action, right? Or it might start with a pranayama practice, or it might start with a pose. And then you can ask those questions relative to that starting point. So even the theming worksheet doesn't have to start with theme. It could start with some other thing on that worksheet, and then asking those questions might lead you to a theme. Okay, Tracy, do I have a favorite modification book you prefer? Always looking to learn and grow. There's a cool book I read. I don't have it here in this apartment, but it's called Cool Yoga Tricks. I think it's by Miriam Austin. That's a cool one. There's some cool ideas in there. It's called Cool Yoga Tricks. So I think it's called Cool Yoga Tricks. But it's not like tricks. It's really more different regressions and modification strategies. I just wrote an endorsement for a new book coming out. So I don't know if I can announce this, but there's a book that Diane Bondi and Kat Hedberg are putting out. I won't announce the title or anything, but that should be out soon. That has some really great modifications in it. So I'd say keep an eye out for what it is they've created. And the short answer beyond that is there's also some great Iyengar resources. I think Yoga the Iyengar Way has a lot of great modifications in it. But again, the reason that I teach the regression progression, is so that you don't need one book necessarily, but you can kind of use your own creativity and own understanding, and the resource of, like, to be honest, much of what I use now is Instagram. I mean, I go on different people's pages and there's so many really cool people sharing interesting modifications of yoga poses, with chairs, with wall, with bolsters. So it would take a long time to share the list of all the people that I follow that have great yoga pose hacks and modifications. But if you remind me, I can share some links in the Facebook group of sources of inspiration for me. Okay, from Lizelle, specific suggestions of isometric and somatic movements as preps for arm balances and inversion. If you check out the 5th session in the isometric strength series, that session is focused on handstand. So if you're wanting to learn some clever drills to work on your handstand practice, I would check out that session. I also have a session on the platform called Handstand 101, I think. It has some, not so much isometric, but it has some drills that are quite useful for a handstand. Yeah, Tanya, I just wrote the endorsement yesterday, so I don't think the book is out yet. It's a new one, but that book is great too. Yoga for Everyone, 50 poses for every type of body. That's also a great resource. Yeah, so those classes are going to give you quite a bit of drills for inversions. In terms of like somatic movements for arm balances, it's not to say that you couldn't take that approach to working on your arm balance. You certainly could, but that would look like kind of regressing the pose. Like often I'm looking at And how would I take the arm balance and do it on my back? How might I connect this arm balance to some of those developmental movement patterns? I don't necessarily have like movements to share with you, but perhaps I'll create a class that takes a somewhat unconventional approach to exploring some arm balances. But I would suggest that based on what you've already learned here, ask those questions. What happens if you do Bakasana on your back? What would happen if you explored some different options with your legs, with your arms? What happens if ... I know that might seem like a non-answer, but it would have to kind of be informed by a more specific pose, and then kind of taking a look at different strategies for working on that pose. Okay. Inette, how would that work in relationship with antagonist theory? If abdominals gently engage while exhale, wouldn't the back muscles have a harder time activating? Not necessarily. So depends on which abdominal muscles, right? So when you exhale, it's not necessarily that your rectus abdominis always engages to pull you into flexion, right? You could be in a back bend and exhale, and that could cause a recruitment of your transverse abdominis, some of the deep core stabilizers, and also of your diaphragm itself, which could be referenced as a core stabilizer. So, using the exhale doesn't always mean spinal flexion, right? You can use an exhale to get taller. And if you put your hands on top of your head and breathe in, when you exhale, press your head and hands together. So your exhale can also leverage ground reaction force to render you taller. So inhale, really, how I think of it is the inhale is more of a sort of three-dimensional expansion, and the exhale is a bit more of a sort of narrowing and a lengthening. Okay? If we tend to think of our exhale as sort of a collapsing or a flexing of the spine, that might be a pattern that we want to ask some questions about and try in some different ways. Because exhale doesn't have to flex us forward necessarily. It could also stabilize us so we could actually backbend further. So the exhale, the accessory muscles of exhalation are not necessarily antagonist muscles to backbend. They could be stabilizing muscles that further assist the efficacy of the backbend, depending on how you organize it. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions. Any others before I hop off? Seems like breathing and movement will be a bit of contextual interference practice for me. Good. Yeah, it's good news. It's good news that you don't have to breathe in a particular way in order to do something, right? If you've noticed, you're moving your body all day, every day, and it's figuring out how and when to breathe to support your movements. And it's probably not a 5-second inhale, 5-second exhale. Every time you lift your chest, you inhale. Every time you flex your spine, you exhale. I think one of the misconceptions or possibly detriments of the yoga practice is that we create very specific correlations between how to move and breathe together that could also kind of limit our options. So it's one thing to encourage you to move and breathe in this way. It's another, as part of our movement practice, it's another thing to suggest that that's how you should always do it. And then we start to kind of become kind of breath robots that connect our movement and breath in perhaps some inefficient ways. So I would just suggest to continue to play with it. And if the contextual interference is just that it's going to kind of buck up against what you've learned before, welcome to the club. Like, that's totally been a key feature. I remember taking a workshop years ago from two teachers that I respect. I respected them both, I'll say equally. They taught 2 workshops on the shoulder girdle back to back. I was at a festival, and they taught the exact opposite thing in the workshop. One was teaching, essentially about scapular abduction, and one was protraction. One was teaching about scapular retraction in the same poses, suggesting that you should always do this one or always do that one, based on the teacher. And I was so confused afterwards. And ultimately, I realized that, neither one of them was right in the sense that you should only do this one or this one. And both were right in the sense that being able to do both created dynamic movement that represented options I wanted to have. So all the teachers that I really love most are the ones that encourage exploration, trying different options, seeing what happens if ... And you might find that to perform this particular skill, it's useful to breathe in this particular way. That also could be considered a progression. If you try reversing your breath, can you still do the skill? So to your point, contextual interference could be a good thing. All right, I want to just take a look at some of these comments because I like them. Yeah, I hope these worksheets prove useful for you. I've structured them in this way so that you can have an ongoing process to kind of relate with this material. Okay, well, more questions popped up. How about that? I think. Oh, thank you. That's a good question. All right, you guys. Well, enjoy the rest of your day or your night or your morning or wherever it may be, wherever you are. And I will see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific. Enjoy the single limb flow practice before then, if you haven't already taken it. And I'll see you very soon. Much love. Mucho namaste. Peace out.